I hid a $34 million inheritance from my parents. Their betrayal changed everything. When the letter from the attorney arrived, I thought it was a scam. Who inherits $34 million out of nowhere? But as I read on, my hands began to shake. My late grandmother, whom my parents had always claimed died penniless, had left everything to me. The instructions were clear: keep it private until I turned 25. I was 23 at the time. That secrecy would soon change everything. My parents had never been kind. They constantly criticized me for not earning enough, for still renting a small apartment, for driving an old car. "You'll never amount to anything," my father would say, sipping his expensive whiskey. I bit my tongue, knowing that I had more money than both of them combined, but I couldn't tell. The will's condition was strict, and honestly, I wanted to see who they really were without the lure of wealth. Months passed, and their behavior worsened. They started borrowing money from me, small amounts at first, 50 here, 100. They're always promising to pay it back. They never did. I didn't mind the money. I minded the entitlement. They'd mock my thriftiness, not knowing I could have bought them a house in cash. It was like watching a cruel play, and I was both actor and audience. One night, my mother called in tears, claiming she and Dad were about to be homeless. They demanded I move back home to help pay bills. I said yes, not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to see how far they would go. I moved in, keeping my secret locked in my heart, while they treated me like their personal servant. Every day, my patience thinned. They'd lecture me at dinner about responsibility and working harder. My father scoffed at my clothes, saying, "If you can't dress for success, you'll never succeed." The irony almost made me laugh. I had more money than the town mayor, but here I was, being told to pick up extra shifts at a coffee shop. My silence was my shield and my weapon. Then came the breaking point. My father invited his business friends over, introducing me as our struggling son who can't get his life together. They laughed. I smiled politely, though my blood boiled. I decided right then that when I turned 25, I would not just reveal the truth. I would make them regret every word. The countdown began. Over the next year, I kept playing my role. I drove them to appointments, cooked meals, and listened to endless lectures about ambition. Meanwhile, my inheritance quietly grew in investments. Every time they mocked me, the moment of reveal felt closer. I was building not just wealth, but a perfect storm. Finally, the day came. I turned 25, I met with the attorney, and the restrictions lifted. The first thing I did was buy a large property in a gated community. I didn't tell my parents. Instead, I invited them to lunch at an upscale restaurant they could barely afford. They arrived in worn clothes, clearly expecting me to pay for a modest meal. When they sat down, I slid a folder across the table. Inside was a copy of the will, bank statements, and the deed to my new home. My mother's jaw dropped. My father's face turned pale. "This is a joke," he muttered. I simply said, "I've been rich for 2 years. You just never noticed because you were too busy looking down on me." The silence was heavy. My mother reached for my hand, suddenly teary. My father stammered an apology, but I could see in his eyes, it wasn't guilt, it was greed. That was the moment I decided they'd never see a cent of my fortune. I stood up, paid the bill with a black card, and walked away, leaving them stunned in the middle of the restaurant. After that lunch, my phone exploded with calls and messages from my parents. At first, they were all apologies, saying they'd made mistakes and wanted to start fresh. But it didn't take long for the tone to change. Soon, they were sending me lists of debts they needed me to pay: mortgage, car loans, credit cards. They even asked for a family allowance, like I was some kind of bank. I didn't reply. For the first time, I blocked their numbers. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about peace. I moved into my new home, a sprawling estate with a pool, library, and more rooms than I could use. The silence inside was beautiful. No lectures, no mockery. Just me and the quiet hum of the life I had built in secret. But peace never lasts when greed is chasing you. One afternoon, my father showed up at the gated entrance, yelling at the security guard to let him in. "My son lives here. He owes us." I watched from an upstairs window, heart pounding not from fear, but from the absurdity of it all. Security escorted him away. That was the last time he tried to come in person. Days turned into weeks, and I poured myself into using my wealth for something good. I funded scholarships, donated anonymously to shelters, and even invested in small businesses struggling to survive. Helping strangers felt better than giving a dime to the people who had treated me like dirt. Every act of kindness felt like reclaiming a part of my soul they'd tried to crush. Then I got a letter not from my parents, but from their lawyer. They were suing me. The claim? That I'd withheld money that should have been theirs. My attorney laughed when he read it. The will was airtight, but the fact that they would try to legally force me to hand over my inheritance told me everything I needed to know. They didn't want me. They wanted my money. We went to court. They came dressed like victims, my mother in a worn dress, my father limping with a cane I'd never seen before. They spun a story about me being an ungrateful child who'd abandoned them in their time of need. I sat there, calm, while my attorney presented evidence of their constant belittling and manipulative behavior. The judge dismissed their case within minutes. As we left the courtroom, my mother hissed under her breath, "You'll regret this." I almost laughed. Regret. The only thing I regretted was ever letting them think they could control me. I walked past them without another word, my lawyer by my side. After that, they vanished from my life. No more calls, no more letters. At first, the silence felt strange, but then it became a gift. I could finally breathe without the weight of their constant criticism. I realized that sometimes, cutting family ties isn't cruelty, it's survival. Over the next few years, my wealth grew even more. I traveled the world, met incredible people, and lived without fear of judgment. But every so often, I'd hear rumors from old acquaintances. My parents were telling anyone who'd listen that I was a heartless millionaire who'd abandoned them. I didn't bother correcting the story, let them talk. Their lies couldn't touch me anymore. One evening, sitting on my balcony watching the sunset, I thought about my grandmother, the woman who had trusted me with this fortune. I understood her now. She must have seen what my parents were, and that's why she left it all to me. In that moment, I silently promised her I'd keep living in a way that would make her proud, and I would never let greed poison my life again. A year later, I was invited to speak at a charity gala about philanthropy. Standing in front of a glittering crowd, I told the story, not the whole truth, but enough to share the lesson. I spoke about betrayal, resilience, and the importance of choosing the people you allow into your life. I noticed some faces in the crowd tear up. It felt powerful to turn my pain into something that inspired others. After the event, a young man approached me. He told me his parents had drained his savings, leaving him homeless. He said hearing my story gave him hope. That moment hit me harder than any award or applause. My money could change lives, but my story could, too. It was then I decided to start a foundation to help people escape toxic family financial abuse. The foundation grew quickly. We provided legal aid, housing assistance, and financial literacy programs. Each success story felt like a quiet victory against the kind of manipulation I'd endured. My parents had taken so much from me emotionally, but they had also given me a mission without even realizing it. One afternoon, while visiting one of the shelters my foundation funded, I spotted a familiar figure in the crowd. My father. His hair was grayer, his frame thinner. He didn't see me at first, but when our eyes met, his expression shifted from shock to something I couldn't quite read: shame, anger, desperation. He walked over slowly, as if expecting me to turn away. "I didn't know this was yours," he said, gesturing to the shelter. His voice was softer than I remembered. For a brief moment, I felt the pull of old memories: birthday dinners, childhood games, but then I remembered the years of cruelty. "I'm not here to talk about the past," I told him. "But I'm glad you're somewhere safe tonight." He nodded, his eyes glistening, but he didn't ask for money. That silence spoke louder than any apology. Maybe life had finally humbled him. Or maybe he just knew I wouldn't open that door again. I left without promising to see him again, but the encounter stayed with me. It made me realize something important. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconnection. Sometimes it's just letting go of the hate so it doesn't own you anymore. I could forgive him in my heart without inviting him back into my life. Months later, I received a handwritten letter from my mother. It was short, almost cold. "We're divorcing. I thought you should know." There was no apology, no warmth, just a statement of fact. I didn't respond. Whatever their lives had become, they had chosen that path. I had chosen mine. The years rolled on, and my foundation flourished. I became known not for my wealth, but for the causes I championed. That was exactly how I wanted it. Money could open doors, but integrity kept them open. My parents' betrayal had once felt like a curse, but it had turned into the very thing that shaped my greatest achievements. On the anniversary of my grandmother's passing, I visited her grave. I brought white lily, her favorite. Tan told her everything: how I had kept her trust, how I had resisted greed, how I had turned her gift into a lifeline for others. As the wind rustled the trees, I felt a deep peace. I had honored her legacy, and in doing so, I had built my own. A few months later, I was invited to a television interview about my foundation. The host asked if my own family supported my work. I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Support comes from those who believe in you," I said. "Blood doesn't guarantee that." The audience fell silent, and I knew my parents, if they were watching, would understand the meaning behind it. Not long after, an email arrived from my mother. She wanted to reconnect, claiming she'd changed and wasn't after money. I read it twice, sensing the familiar undertone of manipulation. Her words were polished, but the history between us couldn't be erased by a few carefully chosen sentences. I didn't reply. One evening, while leaving a charity dinner, I saw her standing across the street. She looked smaller, almost fragile. Our eyes met, but instead of crossing over, I got into my car. Driving away was harder than I expected, but it reminded me of the boundaries I had fought so hard to build. The truth was, success had never been about proving them wrong. It had become about proving myself right. I had survived their cruelty, their greed, and the loneliness they'd left me with. And now, every person my foundation helped was a reminder that I'd turned pain into purpose. Still, some nights, memories crept in. I'd hear my father's mocking laugh or my mother's sharp tone in my head, but instead of anger, I felt pity. They had lived their lives chasing money, yet lost the one thing that could never be bought. One winter morning, I received news that my father had passed away. A part of me expected to feel something: grief, relief, maybe even closure. Instead, there was only quiet acceptance. I didn't attend the funeral. That chapter had ended long before his life did. A week later, my mother reached out again, this time through my attorney. She wanted to settle old misunderstandings. I told my lawyer to decline politely. There was nothing to settle. We were two very different people now, walking separate roads. As the years went on, I traveled to countries I'd only dreamed of, meeting people whose lives were vastly different from mine. Yet I found pieces of myself in their stories: resilience, hope, survival. It reminded me that wealth isn't the great divider people think it is. Compassion is the real bridge. On the 10th anniversary of inheriting my grandmother's fortune, I hosted a gala to celebrate the lives we had changed. Hundreds of people attended: scholarship recipients, business owners, shelter residents. Looking around, I realized this was my true family. People who valued me for my heart, not my bank account. That night, as I stood on the stage, I thought back to the young man who had once been mocked and belittled in his parents' home. He was gone. In his place stood someone stronger, wiser, and free. I had kept my grandmother's secret, but the life I built from it was something the whole world could see. Months after the gala, I received a message from an unknown number. It was short: "I'm proud of you." Mom, I stared at it for a long time, wondering if it was genuine or just another way to slip back into my life. In the end, I deleted it. Some words lose their meaning when they come too late. The foundation's work expanded overseas. We built schools in remote areas and funded medical clinics in places where help rarely reached. Standing in the middle of a new classroom filled with children's laughter, I realized this was the sound of legacy, not the quiet clink of coins, but the roar of lives transformed. My past didn't vanish. Sometimes old wounds ache like weathered scars. But instead of trying to erase them, I learned to wear them like badges. They told the story of where I'd been, and more importantly, how far I'd come. One autumn afternoon, I was sorting through old boxes when I found the original letter from my grandmother's attorney. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but the ink still sharp. Reading it again brought back the rush of disbelief, the weight of the secret, and the thrill of freedom I'd eventually claimed. I framed the letter and hung it in my office, not as a reminder of money, but as a reminder of trust. My grandmother had seen something in me no one else had, and that belief had been worth more than every dollar she left behind. A journalist once asked if I regretted not reconciling with my parents. I told her the truth. I regret that they chose greed over love, but I don't regret protecting myself. Some doors are closed for a reason. She called it one of the most powerful quotes she'd ever heard. In time, the whispers about me in my hometown faded. People stopped asking about my parents, and the narrative of the ungrateful son disappeared into the shadows. What remained was my work, my reputation, and the people I'd helped. That was the legacy I wanted. One summer, I returned to the neighborhood where I grew up. The old family house looked smaller, almost fragile. The windows were dark, the yard overgrown. It struck me that buildings, like relationships, crumble when neglected. I didn't knock on the door. I simply turned and walked away. The truth is, my inheritance wasn't the fortunate, was the freedom. Freedom to choose who I let into my life. Freedom to define success on my own terms. Freedom to build something that outlasted me. Money was just the tool. The life I built was the masterpiece. I often wonder what my grandmother would say if she could see it all. Nava Foundation. The people saved, the man I became. I like to think she'd smile, maybe squeeze my shoulder, and say, "I knew you'd make it count." There's a strange peace in knowing you've broken a cycle. My parents lived chasing wealth they could never hold on to. I lived creating impact that would ripple far beyond my years. That's the kind of richness no one can take away. Years later, I was asked to mentor young entrepreneurs. Many of them came from difficult families. I told them my story not to boast, but to show that pain doesn't have to define you. You can turn it into fuel. You can make something beautiful from something broken. Some nights, I sit in my library with a glass of wine, listening to the quiet. It's not the silence of loneliness anymore, it's the silence of peace, the kind I once thought I'd never know. My mother passed away quietly in a small apartment years after we'd last spoken. There was no dramatic ending, no tearful reunion, just a notice from a lawyer, and the realization that her chapter in my life had long been closed. I didn't attend her funeral either. Instead, I made a large, anonymous donation to a shelter for single mothers. It was my way of ending the story with kindness, without reopening old wounds. Looking back, every moment of betrayal, every cruel word, every humiliating dinner had led me here. Without them, I might not have appreciated the value of trust, the importance of boundaries, or the gift of giving. People often say, money changes you. I disagree. Money doesn't change who you are, it reveals you. My parents' greed was laid bare when wealth came into play. My own heart was tested, and I chose to use it for good. And maybe that's the final lesson my grandmother wanted me to learn. That the real treasure isn't in the bank, it's in the choices you make when you have the power to do anything. I still live in my estate, but it's never felt like a fortress. It's a home filled with friends, laughter, and purpose. And unlike the cold halls of my parents' house, every corner here tells a story of love freely given. So, when people ask how I survived losing my family after gaining a fortune, I tell them the truth. I didn't lose a family, I discovered one. And I didn't just inherit $34 million. I inherited the chance to live a life that mattered.